Marvel Comics has been around for roughly 6 decades. With such a backlog of acclaimed adventures and spellbinding stories, it's difficult to narrow down exactly which storylines deserve the most recognition. What the writer and artist accomplish inspires future storytellers and provides a direction for the character, the universe, and/or the company as a whole. These tall tales did just that and earned the right to be counted among the top 10 greatest Marvel storylines of all time. So what is it that sets these Marvel stories apart from the rest? The general reception by the comic community matters. Spider-Man and Mary Jane Watson were a fan-favorite couple, until Marvel decided to basically annul their marriage with One More Day. Thanks to the vehement fan response, Marvel would retcon this a couple years later. A storyline's lasting impact on the Marvel Universe should also be considered. Bucky was amusing when introduced as Cap's sidekick back in the 40s, but it wasn't until 2005's Winter Soldier that he was made into the badass anti-hero he is today. This impacts everything going forward with Bucky. He'd go on to don the Stars and Stripes himself. Finally, the impression the storyline leaves on other Marvel projects outside of the comics signals to the audience the company's faith in the product. Should a comic storyline be seen in a major motion picture or television series, then it is fully or partially directing the future of a major franchise. Thanks to the Marvel Cinematic Universe, the story of Thanos decimating half of all life and the Avengers disbanding carries more weight than, say, the Inhumans vs. X-Men storyline. The former two were adapted into successful films, while the latter has yet to see its day in the multiplex. The best comic will have all three: outstanding critical reception by fans, the in-universe effects, and its mark on the larger Marvel brand. Fittingly, we begin with a sensational narrative that charts the lives of lowly mortal civilians as they adapt to a world of emerging gods. But before this odyssey begins, make sure to like the video and subscribe to Plot Armor Comics. 10. Marvel's 1993. Alex Ross is a renowned comic artist thanks to the grand iconography of his paintings. Writer Kurt Busiek joined Ross and conceived of what would become Marvels. This 1993 series re-examines battles and events from the universe's history, but told from a civilian's perspective. Phil Sheldon, a man who provides for his family through freelance photography. Sheldon witnesses the death of Gwen Stacy, the heralding of Galactus, and encounters the original X-Men. Sheldon can only watch in astonishment as his world slowly fills up with more superhumans. Some of these are heroes, some are villains. At least classic story arcs like the Avengers against the Masters of Evil or Spider-Man vs. the Green Goblin lead us to believe so. However, Marvel's asks the reader to reconsider everything. No matter the intent behind the X-Men's standoff with Magneto, the sheer magnitude of superpowers places those without such gifts in great danger. It's clear that Busiek and Ross revere the canon of the Marvel Universe much as fans do. The series references nearly 100 other comics. Both writers would continue working for Marvel long afterwards and produce more acclaimed work. However, Marvel's didn't have a heavy impact on the Marvel Universe. After all, the whole idea of the limited series is to explore prior events from a different perspective. The most consequential impact is perhaps the introduction of Phil Sheldon. The character would star in a darker take on the Marvel's concept entitled Ruins in 1995. This would have a variant of Sheldon in a parallel Marvel universe where things are not so heroic. He would return for the sequel series, Marvel's Eye of the Camera, which would see Busiek return as writer. Outside of the Marvel's branch of the universe, the character hasn't received any significant attention. Beyond the comics, he was in the Avengers game in 2020, but it's doubtful he'll appear in the MCU anytime soon. Elements of our next story will be appearing on film much sooner. 9. Kraven's Last Hunt, 1987. While DC has a reputation for being the darker and more mature brand of the two major comic companies, Marvel does its share of grown-up storytelling. Kraven's Last Hunt, an event told across issues of Web of Spider-Man, Amazing Spider-Man, and Peter Parker the Spectacular Spider-Man, features some unabashed plotting and astute themes featuring Kraven the Hunter getting the win over Spidey. What may seem a standard nefarious pursuit of Spider-Man soon becomes more. A deconstruction of what Spider-Man is and how he is perceived by others. This is accomplished when Kraven apparently murders Spidey, assumes his identity, and begins performing heroics around NYC. This consists of him brutalizing criminals rather than simply incapacitating them, culminating in his crusade against the rodent-like vermin. Spidey would recover and confront Kraven, but the legacy of the Hunter's decisive move against the Webhead outlives the story. Kraven's Last Hunt is consistently counted among the greatest Spider-Man stories of all time. The longest-lasting effect the story had on the Marvel Universe came in its concluding panels. A major character is taken out of commission for a while. Additionally, Peter and Mary Jane's relationship was strengthened by the events of the story, as MJ must reckon with the idea of living life without her husband. It's a self-contained story which contributed to its marketability when chosen to be adapted by Sony for their Spider-Man universe. The film is said to be taking cues from Kraven's Last Hunt, but we'll be taking our cue from the next story, jumping ship from the Spidey corner of Marvel and polishing up the good old stars and stripes. 8. The Winter Soldier, 2005. As far back as the Captain America character goes, it's actually impressive how recent his best solo story is. Published in 2005, it was writer Ed Brubaker's first project for Marvel following over a decade at DC. Brubaker partnered with artist Steve Epting to deliver a thrilling action adventure tinged with historical allegory and political intrigue. The Winter Soldier would resurrect an old ally and make him a villain. Gone was Captain America's trusty boy wonder from the classic canon. Now, Bucky had not only been recovered after his apparent demise, but had also been brainwashed into serving the Soviet cause. Cap must face his former brother-in-arms as well as the turmoil inside him. There was a hunger for political commentary during the early to mid-2000s, and the reimagining of Bucky as the Winter Soldier hit a lot of the right notes. Bucky would become the Winter Soldier full-time, and the character would prove instrumental in a number of conflicts. The character illuminated something very important in Captain America, that the caricatured Star-Spangled Man was still relevant. Cap would take on a more nuanced aura following the Winter Soldier storyline. The titular anti-hero himself would branch out from comics with appearances in animation, video games, and the MCU. The storyline and title would be adapted for the first Captain America sequel, The Winter Soldier. The character has appeared in 7 MCU projects and is slated for the cinematic iteration of the Thunderbolts come 2024. Bucky is also a rare character that has accrued goodwill outside of comic fandom. Sebastian Stan, the actor behind The Winter Soldier, acknowledged this when recalling fans' attachment to Bucky on account of the trauma the character has endured. Needless to say, The Winter Soldier has left quite a mark on both the comic and cinematic landscapes of Marvel. Combined with the partial rehabilitation that Buddy brought to his buddy Cap, Andy makes for a great BFF. Now, if only he could travel through time and save all of humanity from annihilation at the hands of massive robotic overlords. What, he can't do that? Well, don't worry, Buckster. I'm sure better days of future past will come. 7. Days of Future Past, 1981. The X-Men boast a plethora of engaging adventures, but only a handful endure to become classic stories. One of these came about in 1981, courtesy of Star Wars X-Men scribe Chris Claremont and longtime partner John Byrne. Days of Future Past told in the pages of Uncanny X-Men. The story tells of an adult Kitty Pryde condemned to a cruel fate in a dystopian future ruled by prejudicial hysteria. Mutants are pursued by massive robotic guardians called Sentinels and confined to internment camps. To prevent such an atrocious future, Kitty transfers her consciousness to her younger self, i.e. the Kitty of present day. She entrusts her younger self to assemble the X-Men and prevent the momentous event that set the world on the pathway to that future. An enthralling journey through a very distinct parallel setting, Days of Future Past would leave a hearty legacy on the Marvel Universe. Firstly, it is the debut of Rachel Summers, the daughter of the Cyclops and Jean Grey of the dystopian timeline. She would become a powerful mutant in her own right, claiming the power of the Phoenix Force at one point. Finally, if Days of Future Past sounded familiar, it's probably due to the number of times the storyline has been adapted outside of comics. The classic X-Men animated series from the 1990s explores the idea throughout its inaugural season. Another cartoon, 2009's Wolverine and the X-Men, would adapt elements as well in its one and only season. Then, the early 2010s saw the storyline receive its own feature film. 2014's X-Men Days of Future Past would streamline the story and shift the focus from Kitty to Wolverine, but otherwise honor the classic tale. Despite all this, it is still exclusively an X-Men story. Marvel wouldn't just throw everyone together just yet. Then, 3 years later, things would indeed change for good. 6. Secret Wars, 1984 to 85. Though the wars proclaimed to be secret, everyone and their mother was involved in what was Marvel's first ever crossover event. Mattel, the toy company, would request a comic bringing all of the Marvel heroes together, so that they could sell more superhero toys. Comics under capitalism, folks. Secret Wars has a simple premise. The heroes and villains of the Marvel Universe find themselves transported to Battleworld, a place created by an entity known as the Beyonder. The latter has been observing metahumans in the mainstream universe and decides to enact a game of sorts. Stocking his Battleworld with weaponry, the Beyonder's only directive upon shipping them to his arena is, excuse the pun, but beyond vague. Slay your enemies, and all that you desire shall be yours. Nothing you dream of is impossible for me to accomplish. We can't help but wonder if the character of the Beyonder was meant to parallel children playing with toys. The only real difference between the two is that the former swapped out his action figures for the real thing. Regardless of its origins, Secret Wars left a couple of lasting legacies in the wider Marvel Universe. for starters, it was the first crossover event. Subsequent favorites like Civil War, Infinity Gauntlet, and Avengers vs. X-Men wouldn't have come about if not for the ground broken by Secret Wars. Plus, it would birth a new fan-favorite character. A lethal protector, one might say. That's right, Secret Wars would introduce this symbiote when it bonded with Spider-Man, thus inadvertently leading to the creation of Venom. A sequel event in 2015, again titled Secret Wars, put its own spin on the Battleworld concept by making it an amalgamation of other designated Marvel universes. What If would spend time in Battleworld in 1998 exploring the prospect of the Marvel heroes becoming stranded on the fledgling planet. If the formation of events, the genesis of Venom, and follow-up stories aren't enough, then consider the impact that Secret Wars has had on the larger Marvel brand. It would sell some toys in the 80s, sure, but the story would receive partially animated adaptations via 1994's Spider-Man and 2013's Avengers Assemble. However, the MCU will be returning to Avengers films in 2025 and 2026, the latter of which will be adapting Secret Wars. So, the story's influence is only set to expand. But no more toys, people. Our next story is one of the darkest moments in Marvel history, forever changing the character of Spider-Man. And it all happened in one night. Yep, it's that night. 5. The night Gwen Stacy died, 1973. The Silver Age of comics was dead. Laid to rest were the campy overtones, bright colors, and hopeful optimism that defined many iconic stories of the era. The subsequent time, known as the Bronze Age, would venture into more mature territory, exploring ideas and themes that would captivate an adult audience. This had begun cropping up before Spider-Man and Gwen had their fateful run-in with the Green Goblin. However, Jared Conway and Gil Kane's The Night Gwen Stacy Died would act as the final nail in the Silver Age's coffin. It's a short story told over only 2 issues of Amazing Spider-Man. However, the events were so shocking that those 2 issues would become synonymous with the character of Spider-Man himself. Norman Osborn is the Green Goblin, but at the beginning of the story, he suffers, or benefits, from amnesia. Therefore, he simply cannot remember his alter ego. However, his son Harry has become addicted to drugs, and this, combined with other stresses of life, coaxes a breakdown in Norman, which in turn triggers the Goblin. He then proceeds to kidnap Gwen and hold her hostage at the George Washington Bridge. Side note, it's unclear what bridge it is actually. While the art shows the Brooklyn Bridge, the actual text says the George Washington Bridge. We'll just call it the Goblin Bridge. So Spidey proceeds to confront the Goblin there, and the rest is bittersweet Spidey lore. The maturity of the subject matter, as well as the outcome of the story, initially received some heat, but in hindsight, has been recognized as the bold tale that it is. Arnold T. Blumberg, writing for Reconstruction, would declare it the end of innocence in superhero stories. A time when a defeated hero could not save the girl, when fantasy merged uncomfortably with reality, and morality was finally visited on the world of comics. To coin a cliche, nothing would ever be the same. And he was right. The rest of the 70s would see such heavier Hallmark titles as Iron Man's Demon in a Bottle, which tackled alcoholism, or the Green Lantern Green Arrow comics that explored drug use and poverty. The event would be referenced throughout the rest of the Marvel Universe history, like when it became the subject of an intense debate between Cap and Iron Man during the superhuman Civil War. What If would take a crack at exploring alternative outcomes for Gwen's death. A notable one involved Peter Parker becoming the Punisher and killing Green Goblin before he could do it. Marvel wouldn't let non-comic fans forget about the event either. It received a relatively faithful adaptation in 2014's Amazing Spider-Man 2, as well as some nods during the runaway hit Spider-Man No Way Home. It's fair to say that Gwen's death changed the Spider-Man mythos. While it took just one woman to do it for Spidey, it would take Lady Death herself to change the mythos of the entire Marvel Universe in our next story. 4. Infinity Gauntlet, 1991. I am inevitable. Perhaps no truer words have ever been spoken by the Mad Titan. Granted, while he wouldn't say those words until 2019's Avengers Endgame, they described Thanos' destiny way back in 1991. It was inevitable, following the events of Jim Starlin's Infinity Gauntlet, that the character was destined for great things. While the villain had meted out plenty of death and destruction before, Thanos finally reached his potential when he gathered the Infinity Gems and donned the titular gauntlet, all in an attempt to impress Lady Death, a fittingly cold woman whom the Titan had fallen for. As one would imagine, mass loss of life is what Thanos' reason would register for her, resulting in his snapping half of all life out of existence. The remaining heroes of the Marvel Universe, as well as a villain or two, confront Thanos, leading to an epic battle on a grand cosmic scale. The events would reverberate throughout the universe after the damage was undone. The story would receive immediate sequels, with Infinity War landing in 1992 and Infinity Crusade the following year. A little over a decade later, and Thanos would receive his own titular series which would reference the events of Infinity Gauntlet. The modern Secret Wars event would do the same. A favorite topic of What If comics has been to imagine different heroes stealing the Gauntlet from Thanos rather than just his daughter Nebula. Outside of comics, Infinity Gauntlet would receive a partial adaptation in 2013's Avengers Assemble. The real legacy, though, exists in the movie space. Phases 1 through 3 of the MCU have been christened the Infinity Saga. 2018's Avengers Infinity War, itself part of Phase 3, took tremendous inspiration from the comic story, as well as its sequel, Avengers Endgame. The latter would deal with the fallout of Thanos' decimation of half of all life in the universe, with the titular team working furiously to undo the damage the villain had wrought. The films, as well as Josh Brolin's portrayal of Thanos, have been widely praised by comic fans and mass audiences. The following films in the series, otherwise known as Phase 4, have continued wrestling with the ramifications, both large and small, of Thanos' actions. To say Infinity Gauntlet left an impression is an understatement. It was yet another example of Marvel's genius use of events and established Thanos as a formidable player in the universe. The Mad Titan, certainly after this story, truly became inevitable. Just as inevitable as Frank Miller popping up on a greatest of list. The man is a devil with the written word, and perhaps that's why our next story was such a revelation. 3. Born Again, 1986. Earlier, we discussed the Bronze Age of comics, etched in stone by the death of Gwen Stacy. This was a period of maturation for the stories told in comic books, touching on heavy topics like alcohol, drug use, and poverty. This era, though, could only be followed one of two ways. Either a reversion to the innocence of yesteryear, or an even darker foray into the mythology of metahumans. History would choose the latter and usher in the modern age of comics, which continues to this day. Frank Miller, the legendary comic book writer, would become such a legend because he'd penned two classic storylines around the same time in 1986 for both DC and Marvel. While most may cite his take on Batman and The Dark Knight Returns as his most crucial work, Marvel fans counter with his pivotal Daredevil storyline, Born Again. And rightly so. The gritty, merciless tale told in the panels of Daredevil sees the titular man without fear, stripped of everything and at the edge of his sanity. Karen Page had left to become an actress, but soon found herself addicted to hard drugs and appearing in pornographic films. Yeah, now the Bronze Age is looking childish. In a decision that would come to torment Matt Murdock, Karen would sell her ex-boyfriend's secret identity for a shot of heroin. When the information reaches Kingpin's ears, he works to dismantle Matt's life by every measure, such as freezing his bank accounts and getting him barred from practicing law. Matt grows more desperate as he tries to uncover what's happening. Miller uses striking religious imagery and symbolism, hinted at by the very title of the story arc. The term born again is used to describe a newly converted Christian. They have been born again as a follower of the faith's central figure, Jesus Christ. This arc would inform the character of Daredevil for years to come, as the character's faith would play a substantial role in his life as a vigilante. The brilliant way through which Miller utilized this aspect enlightened future writers for the character of the potential. It would initiate the onset of the modern age, which saw the rise of darker material and the exploration of the anti-hero, the mold of which Miller's Daredevil certainly fit. It would inspire a follow-up arc, Dan G. Chichester's Last Rites, which contains similar themes and resolves some plot threads from the original. Finally, Born Again was partially adapted for Marvel's Daredevil streaming series for its third and final season. Or so we thought. Marvel is once again set to adapt the arc for a Disney Plus show in 2024, firmly set within the MCU. So the storyline is literally being born again in the MCU. Hopefully, the next story can receive the same treatment someday. 2. The Dark Phoenix Saga, 1981. There have been two cinematic adaptations of the Dark Phoenix Saga, and neither one has been fully satisfying to comic readers. That is an enormous pity given how renowned this story is. Written by studious X-Men scribe Chris Claremont during the receding of the Bronze Age, the story recounts how the gifted X-Man Jean Grey would nearly fall to the temptations of power. This enticing would come courtesy of the Phoenix Force, a cosmic entity capable of empowering its host at the expense of said host's control. She would be deceived by the villainous mastermind along with his Hellfire Club, and it would take an extraordinary effort by her fellow X-Men to break her from this episode. And it would certainly break them. Several times, the overpowered Jean would become the terrifying Dark Phoenix, a being with outstanding potential and a huge chip on her shoulder. It's an emotional roller coaster of a tale, taking time to explore each of the titular mutant's thoughts relating to Jean, her abilities, and what can be done to help her. The Dark Phoenix moniker would become synonymous with Jean Grey, as the names would be used interchangeably to refer to the character. A sequel story sees Mastermind attempt to exact revenge for the events of the original saga. This would involve the supposed resurrection of Dark Phoenix via Jean Jean Grey clone, Madeline Pryor. Pryor would continue on to become a supervillain in her own right, primarily of the X-Men, and the mother of the time-traveling anti-hero, Cable. The story was a momentous event for the time as it featured a female hero confronting her dark side, and it was done in a nuanced and tasteful way. The Dark Phoenix saga would find an audience outside of comics as it was iconically adapted for the 1990s X-Men animated TV series, as well as the 2009 cartoon Wolverine and the X-Men. However, as a testament to its importance within the Marvel canon, the saga has been adapted twice in live action. First come 2006's X-Men The Last Stand, which was not a faithful retelling at all. Nevertheless, fans wanted to see it done right, and the franchise tried again in 2019's Dark Phoenix. This would fail to live up to expectations, but the fact that the filmmakers chose to attempt it twice just speaks to how much the comic community was talking about it. It's simply one of the best Marvel stories ever written. The second best, specifically. Ironically, it would take tearing our favorite heroes apart to bring out the best in Marvel storytelling. 1. Civil War, 2006-7. Yes, we have finally arrived at the greatest Marvel storyline of all time. While it was initially controversial when it was published circa 2006, Marvel's Civil War was something comic readers hadn't seen on such a massive scale. Rather than the typical heroes versus villains setup, alliances faded and the dividing lines blurred as the American government instituted the Superhuman Registration Act following a catastrophic case of collateral damage involving the New Warriors team. This law, supported by heroes like Iron Man, Spider-Man, and the entirety of S.H.I.E.L.D., would require mass vigilantes and superheroes to register their identities with the government. Another group of heroes, led by Captain America and featuring the likes of Black Panther and Luke Cage, would oppose the law by citing the required loyalty to the government. Heroes would come to blow with other heroes, with separate Avengers teams cropping up in the wake of the Lost Passage. It was an enormous story, encompassing titles from Blade to Fantastic Four, to Cable and Deadpool, and Punisher War Journal. The wide-ranging scope of the legislation would leave no stone unturned as far as heroes and villains, affecting everyone who dared attempt to take justice into their own hands or propagate injustice. Lives are lost during this, and the stakes for the Marvel Universe are simply never higher. Even as half the universe was snapped away by Thanos, the heroes' status quo is not as overturned as it is during the superhuman Civil War. The consequences of this event can fill up a list all their own. Captain America ends up assassinated, Spider-Man's identity is revealed to the world, Aunt May is put in a hospital by a hitman's bullet, Iron Man becomes head of S.H.I.E.L.D., and Mr. Fantastic, along with his wife Sue Storm, leave the Fantastic Four. They were replaced by T'Challa and Storm though, so all in all, let's be honest, a bit of an upgrade for the team. Spider-Man would eventually have to face the consequences of his Civil War-era decisions during the events of One More Day. Interestingly enough, the latter would become one of the most derided story arcs in Spider-Man's history. Finally, a sequel event simply entitled Civil War II followed a decade later and saw Iron Man face off with Captain Marvel this time round. Beyond the panels, Civil War has greatly influenced the MCU, beginning with 2016's Captain America Civil War. It was a streamlined adaptation, nowhere near the breadth or scope of the comic event. However, it's often cited as one of the most important films in the franchise as it set the stage for the rest of the Infinity Saga. The disbanding of the Avengers presented in Civil War would allow for a weaker Earth when Thanos arrived to collect the Infinity Stones a few films later. The scars born out of the superhuman infighting depicted in this incredible event would be visible within the Marvel Universe and the MCU, and cement a universal truth. That good is not black or white, but varying tints of gray that can cause as much conflict as any black and white evil. It ripped the Marvel Universe apart, but Civil War reminded readers of the potential of superhero storytelling, and for that, we'll rebuild. These are the great ones. These are the stories that will inspire future superhero storytellers and will undoubtedly continue to influence future arcs, as well as other forms of media. Remember, they adapted Dark Phoenix twice. Whether they made the list or not, the stories of Marvel's library await the imaginative minds seeking to soar with the super. Thanks for watching. I'm Alexandra Macedo, and I'll see you in the next video.